So hi everybody, I'm Cath and I'm working with SALT as a consultant, and today we're going to be going through quizzes. This is, as you can see, this is part one of two webinars where we're addressing quizzes because it's quite a large area, and today primarily we're going to be focusing on understanding question types. So there will be some things that we'll skip over a little bit today, but we'll pick up again tomorrow. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague who's here with me as well today. Cheng-Wen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll just wave. I think most people were in this previous session yesterday. So shall we just jump right in? So I'm Cheng-Wen at SALT,
Yes.
obviously. Yeah, let's jump right in.
Great. Thanks, Cheng-Wen. Right, so as we said, there's a lot to pack into this webinar. So you might feel at some points that we're going really, really fast, and we probably are, but we will get the recording link to you, and we will give you the link to the slides, so you can always revert back to that at the end. We're just going to give you a bit of a disclaimer up front. As most of you were in our presentation yesterday, I'm sure you are familiar with the fact that these slides, they may be updated from time to time as certain things within the Brightspace environment is slightly in flux. So we will update the slides accordingly. And you may see some things changing slightly, but the slides at the moment are as the Brightspace environment is at this moment in time. In terms of questions, if you would like to ask questions as we're going through, please either raise your hand and you're welcome to speak because we are quite a small group today. So I would welcome you speaking and asking your question, or if you would rather put it into the text chat, you can do that too. And if you prefix it with a Q, then we'll be able to pick it up as being a question and we can address that as we're going through. Right, so today's webinar, we will cover basically looking at creating a new quiz, and then within that new quiz area, we're going to be looking at the subsections of properties, restrictions, assessment, and submission views. We'll be looking at how to add a question to a quiz. We'll then really briefly, because there's quite a few question types, we'll really briefly go through the various question types that Brightspace offers. And you will see that there's quite a bit of overlap with some of the question types that were available in Vula. So if you were familiar with that, this will be familiar territory for you. And then we'll take a brief look at how to do the shuffling with the questions and what I call the pagination. And then we'll take a look at the action menu options and then how to look at some of the statistics that are available once quizzes have been taken by students. So as you can see, that is not everything. As we mentioned, this is part one, and we will pick up with a lot of other things pertaining to quizzes in our second part of our webinar, which will be happening tomorrow at the same time. Right, so we're going to jump straight in, and I'm sure you're fairly familiar with the quiz tool. So it obviously allows you to create these point measured assessments. It gives you a way of evaluating users' learning. You can create and manage quizzes using the question library, and that's something we're going to touch on more tomorrow. It gives you a way to organize quizzes into categories to make it easier to find. And using the quiz preview option here within Brightspace, you can also step through the quiz, including all the way up to submission point, and actually go back and look at those submissions in the preview mode. And as mentioned, we can also have a look at some of the quiz statistics, such as grade distribution, grade averages, and user statistics on the statistic page. So those are some of the features that the quiz tool allows you to engage in. And we are going to move straight on, and I'm sure that all of you are very familiar with this landing page of getting to the Brightspace environment, which resides at uct.brightspace.com. And this is what you will be greeted with. As we have a lot of people in this webinar that were with us yesterday. I checked with you guys yesterday and you all said you were fine with accessing Brightspace and have no problems or challenges in that regard. So that's great to hear. So when landing here, you would obviously hop right on through using the UCT login button, and you would land on what we call the UCT homepage, where you would see the courses that you are aligned to. and they would either be in the section that is demarcated there in red under My Courses. So everybody will have a different selection of courses, or you could use the waffle icon or the course selector, which is at the top, which will give you the comprehensive list of all of your courses. So we are going to simulate that we are jumping into this course, which is outlined in red here. And when you go into a course site, this is what a course homepage would look like. And as you can see, there's a nav bar running across the top that will be consistent in all of your course sites. And the easiest way to actually find where the quizzes reside would be under the activities menu option. But as with everything in Brightspace, there's often more than one way to actually get to do something. So another way to also find your quizzes would be go to Manage Course. And under that, you will see an option called Course Admin. And when you go to Course Admin, this actually gives you the links to all of the tools that will be available within your course site. So the quickest way to get there would be to go via Activities and then just jump straight down to Quizzes. Right, so now we're going to have a look at creating a new quiz, a quiz from scratch. Let's see how we're going to do that. So when you arrive on the new quiz page, you will see two buttons there. And of course, the most prominent one is to create a new quiz. So that's pretty intuitive. You would just click immediately on the new quiz button. Once you had clicked on that button, you would be presented with a page that had various properties or settings, if you want to think of them like that, pertaining to actually setting up your new quiz. So I've highlighted various important areas here, but just to note that the bottom three areas there, where I have marked it as being a collapsed view. Normally, when you arrive on this page, those three sections are actually shown in expanded view. I've just collapsed it here for the purposes of fitting everything onto the screenshot. At the top, you will see for a new quiz, you also have a downward pointing arrow that gives you various menu options, and that would be preview, grade, reports, and statistics. We're going to come back to these things because obviously you're setting up a new quiz from scratch. None of those menu options will give you anything at this stage because you're still in the initial building stages. So right at the top of your new quiz, it's important to note that you have various tabs. So the first tab that opens there is one called Properties, and that's the one we're on right now, is the Properties view. And there is another whole set of settings under the next tab, which would be Restrictions. The third tab along would be Assessment, and the fourth tab along would be Submission Views. So as you can see, there are quite a few properties pertaining to quizzes. Not all of them are mandatory. You don't have to be setting all of these properties, but it's just good to know where these properties are. And if you're very familiar with setting up quizzes in Vula, you would obviously want to know where you can do in Brightspace what you could do in Vula. So that's the purpose of this webinar, is to actually highlight those areas so that you are able to create quizzes in Brightspace as easily as you were within Vula. So on this properties page, below the tabs, you have the title or the name where you're going to actually give your quiz a title. Underneath that, you have an area where you can assign it to a category. So categories are completely optional. It's just a way of kind of sorting and filtering and organizing your quizzes. So they can be useful, and we're not going to touch on that today. That's something we'll look at tomorrow. The next section is where you would actually add quiz questions. We're going to come back to this and delve into that quite a bit in this webinar, but that is the area where you actually add the questions to your quiz. And then the bottom three areas, which we said were in the collapsed view: description, page header, footer, and optional advanced properties. We're going to look at more on the next slide. And right at the bottom, you'll see the save and close options, or the save option if you want to save what you've done up until that point and then work a little bit more. Right, so on the next slide, we'll take a look at the expanded version of those three sections. So you can see there the description, the page header and footer. And you can see in each instance, they have the rich text editor. And as you can see there, these are completely optional. You don't need to fill these in, but they're just extras if you would want to. And as you can see, a description is something which is shown before the quiz. The information for the page header and the page footer, that is something that's shown at the top with the header and obviously at the bottom with the footer on every page of the quiz. So if it was necessary for your quiz presentation to have some kind of persistent static, either information or image, this is where you could make use of page headers and footers. Right, and on the next slide, at the very bottom there are some optional advanced properties. So under this section is where you will find places where you can mark with check boxes if you would like to allow hints within your quiz. If you would like to disable a right click, there's some information there. I'm not going to go through all of it now. You can take a look at it as to the possible implications of disabling the right click. So when you do something like that, you must always think really carefully if that's going to work for your particular context. And there's an option to also disable email, instant messaging, and alerts. And again, to think carefully if in your particular instance this will work. And then the notification email, this is where you can enter one or several email addresses to be notified of submissions for quizzes. And once you have set those various properties or options, you can click Save. Right, on the next slide, we'll take a look at some of the restrictions. So this is now moving on to the second tab in the when you're setting up a new quiz, and it is called the Restrictions tab. And as you might expect, these are the things which are kind of dependent as to how the quiz is presented. So the first thing you have there is the option to hide this from the user. So that governs the visibility. And there are other places to also govern the visibility, but this is one of the most obvious places where you could hide a quiz from users. This is also the place where you'll be setting up all the dates. And as would be expected, you have start dates, end dates, and due dates. So this is the space where you need to set the dates. And just to note that in this instance, when you are setting the dates, you'll see that they're slightly grayed out at the moment. You have to first check the checkbox for the date and the time field to become active. So if you wanted to set a due date, for instance, you would first check the checkbox and then the date and the time field would become active. And at the bottom there, you also have release conditions. We spoke a little bit about release conditions yesterday as well. So this is where you could either attach an existing release condition or you could actually create one at this point, which basically governs how a user would have access to this particular quiz. So if you were going to create a new one, it would give you a drop-down list of various ones. This screenshot does not show all of the release conditions. These are just some of the ones that are available. But for example, you could say, I don't want this user to have access to this quiz until they had completed a particular checklist item on the checklist. So this would be a way to grant access to the quiz based on a release condition. I can see a question here from Chris. He's saying, on my sandbox, the hide from users and due dates checkboxes are all already ticked. Okay, great. All right, so they may be ticked, but this is where you can actually tick or untick them. But just to note that the dates particularly, sometimes people forget to tick the little checkbox and then they're wondering why they can't enter dates. So it's just important to know that those checkboxes do need to be ticked for the dates to become editable or active. Thanks, Chris, for that feedback. Right, so still under the restrictions area, as you might expect, this is also where you could set a password. So this is very similar to Vula, and I'm sure you've worked with passwords before. It's also a space where you can restrict by IP. There's also pros and cons relating to that. And there's also a space for timing. So here you have either a recommended timing or you have an enforced timing. So the recommended will be displayed when the quiz starts, and you can see there's a checkbox there as well to show the clock. So show the clock would be similar to the Vula timer. So in Vula, you know, you have the bar that decreases across the top of your screen. So in Brightspace, they have a clock. And if you would like to enforce a time limit, then you can select that radio button and you can enter the amount of minutes. And you can also decide if you would like to have a grace period where you can say how many minutes before it is flagged as exceeding the time limit. And you can also see there's various options there at the bottom. If they exceed the time limit, what kind of behavior would you like to invoke? So I am going quite quickly through this, and I realize that I am, but just to remind you that the recording and the slides will be available to you. And as each of you have access to a sandbox, and I'm sure you've been testing this and trying it out in your sandbox, you're welcome to also drop me an email if there's anything that is not working as expected or you have a query. Right, on the next screen there, you can see this is also the place where you can allocate special access. So as we said yesterday, special access can either be for an individual, a single user, or it can be for a group of users. And this is particularly for people or groups who need to access the quiz outside of the regular timing or dates that have already been allocated to the quiz. So sometimes you have students that are allowed to have extra time, or maybe there's some students that are going to be writing at a different date even than some other students. This is where you would note that. So you would select what it is that needs to be exceptional, if it's the date or the time, or maybe it is the actual duration of the quiz itself. And you can select those options there. And then on the next screen, you'll see that you can apply that either to an individual, in which case you'll be presented with the class list and you would check the checkbox in front of the user that you would like to apply it to. Or if you had already created a group where you had put a group of students that all needed a similar special access, you could view by group and then add the checkbox in front of that group to apply the special access settings to either the individual or the group. So special access is found under the restrictions tab for the quiz. Right, I'm seeing a question here from Aslam talking about Vula has a lockdown browser. Is there something similar here? Yes, there is the facility to have lockdown browser within the Brightspace environment, Aslam. I think we haven't tested that completely yet. So I will stand at the point of saying that the facility exists to have a lockdown browser, yes. We have not fully tested it, but I'm sure that once we have tested that comprehensively, we would make that available in the new environment as well. Thank you, Aslam. And then Keenan is asking, Vula has the option of a text box where you can load all your questions and then Vula loads them automatically. This is so you do not have to upload one question at a time. Does Brightspace have something similar? Keenan, can I just check with you? Are you meaning uploading the questions via a file?
Hi, no, so it's if I have my exam paper, I set my exam paper a certain way so that the questions can match the format of the Vula question. And then I would do that on my Word document. And then I will just copy all of my questions, whether it's an MCQ or a short answer question or true or false. I would copy all of my questions from my Microsoft Word document, and then I would copy and paste it into the text box that's on Vula. And all my questions will be in that text box, and then I'll say create assessment, and then all of my questions will load at one time, and that saves me time in having to upload one question at a time.
Right. Okay, so there is a feature on Brightspace where you can actually capture questions in a spreadsheet. It's a CSV. And they do give you a downloadable template to follow. So that would be somewhat similar to what you're saying, because effectively you're saying, other than authoring questions individually, one by one within the Brightspace environment, what other mechanisms exist to actually almost bulk upload questions effectively. So
Yeah.
Brightspace does give you a template. It's a CSV, and you can capture your questions there, and it does give you an example of each of the question types. So as long as you save it in that same acceptable file format and you are keeping consistently to the template styles that are applied to that particular question type, you could theoretically compose your complete exam using the template and upload that into Brightspace.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, like, we have about 30 odd courses for the year, and most of our exams are online. They're at fast, like they're at campus, but they are done on the computer.
Right.
So yeah, the kind of peak, and I'm the only administrator, so the kind of peak
Yeah,
would make
big
my
admin
job.
load.
Yeah, if I had to do every exam paper
Definitely.
one question at a time.
Great, but thanks also for alerting us to that as well, because as I mentioned in yesterday's webinar as well, we do like getting this feedback of particular things that are high priority, especially even in certain departments, because it makes us aware that we need to supply that same functionality that you had in Vula, and or find something that works similarly within the Brightspace environment. Thanks for that,
Yeah,
Keenan.
thank you.
Right, so we're going to move on to the third tab, which is all about assessment. So this is where you can find settings pertaining to whether you would like this to be graded or not, whether you would like to automatically publish evaluation or feedback, how many attempts you would like students to actually have for this, if you would like them to retake incorrect questions, and also which grade you would like to have, if you would like to have the highest attempt, the lowest attempt, the average, first or last. So as you can see here, there's various settings that you can apply in terms of assessing an actual quiz submission. And I'm going to move on fairly swiftly to the next slide, which pertains to submission views. So a submission view is the kind of the confirmation feedback that a user would receive after they had submitted their quiz. So you know, within Vula, you normally submit your quiz and then you get that automated email that comes through to you confirming that your quiz has been satisfactorily submitted. Depending on what kind of question types you have contained within your quiz, you might have a quiz that is composed all of questions which are automatically marked, in which case you might have decided to have that mark released immediately to the student, or you might have question types which need to be manually marked, in which case you would delay the feedback of the actual marking itself and just send the basic information to say that the quiz was successfully received. So you do have a link there where it is called default view, and that will actually show you what it is, the default information that students would receive upon their submission. So at the moment, the default view is to send it immediately, sorry, not show the questions, and to not show any statistics. You can, however, add an additional view, or you can decide to actually edit slightly the default view. So if you add an additional view, you have some additional settings where you can include more information into that feedback, that initial feedback that students actually receive. And on the next slide, you'll be able to see some of these elements that you could potentially add to an additional view. So it gives them an opportunity to see more information. So you can give it a particular title and a message if you would like to. You can decide if you want to restrict this feedback to a particular date, an IP address, or even limit the duration of time that students have access to this additional information. And then as far as the details go, you can decide that you would like to show them the questions, and you have a variety of options there of questions that you could level of detail of the questions you could allow them to see. You could allow them to see the answers, and you could also allow them to see the score. And then you could also allow them to see the statistics. So there's various checkboxes and radio buttons so that you can compose and decide how much information you would like students to actually see after the quiz. But when creating these additional views, something to just take note of is if you are having a quiz, for example, where you might have a group of students that have special access. So in other words, not all your students are writing at the same time, and you have elected to give the students a special additional view that actually gives them all the answers, you will actually be serving up your answers before the second lot of students has actually gone through and done the quiz. So you just need to think really carefully when creating additional views that it works for the context of your particular quiz that you are composing. Stefan, I see you have a question here that says, if you edit the default, does that then pertain to all quizzes? When you say backdated, so the default we were talking about here, the submission view, is that email that gets triggered once the quiz has actually been submitted. So when you say backdated, it's not going to resend an old email, but if you took a quiz which you had used previously and then maybe made it then it kind of the timing had expired and then you reused it again, yes, this default would then be triggered from then on for any other subsequent quiz submission. Does that answer your question, Stefan?
Yes, it does. Sorry, I think I missed the part where you specify that it's an email that's sent out. I thought this was just a sort of submission feedback view in the platform itself.
Yeah, so it comes through as an email, but it is actually available within the platform itself as well. So when they kind of go onto the kind of dashboard, it shows that they've actually submitted it, and then they can click a link to actually see this particular feedback. So you are also correct as well that they actually have access to it via 2 channels.
Okay, so yeah, just to follow up then on that. So let's say quiz 1 was set with default settings where the answers aren't shown. And then for quiz 2, I edit the default such that it does show the answers. Will quiz 1's answers then be visible? I think that summarizes
I
my question.
believe. Okay, yeah. All right. So I believe not, because it will only come into effect as of when you've actually applied it. So it won't retrospectively go and apply that setting to the, if you want to think of this almost like, it's kind of a report, if you want to think of it like that. And because it is visible within the platform as well, it wouldn't apply, to my best of my knowledge, it wouldn't retrospectively apply that setting to ones where that report had kind of already been generated based on the default at that time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stefan, for raising that. Right, so we are going to go really quickly through adding a question to a quiz. And this is really going to be very, very high level, as I said, because I'm sure you're all very familiar with adding questions to quizzes. So I think it will just be of interest to you to note where those particular settings are so that you're able to do the same thing in Brightspace that you were within Vuller. So as we found when we first started this and we looked at the first tab, the properties tab when creating a new quiz, the quiz questions are added using the add edit questions button. Once you click that button, you will see 2 options there. So you can either add questions and it will give you a drop-down list of all the available question types, or you have an option to import. And this is where Keenan, I was mentioning that there is the option to upload a file. So if you decide to upload a file, it will actually pop up a window where it will give you the downloadable template, which gives you the format that is required to actually capture those questions in the CSV format. You'll also see in the import, there's an option there for question library, but we are not touching on that today. We'll take a look at that tomorrow. So today we're going to primarily look at adding a question and looking at the 11 different question types that exist within the Brightspace environment. Right, and on the next slide, we're going to take a look at the different quiz question types that are available. As I mentioned, there are 11 question types. So you can see here, some of these will be very familiar to you, very kind of default options that you would have, like true, false, multiple choice, written response. I'm sure you're very familiar with those, matching, fill in the blanks, etc. So we're going to have a quick look and a very quick look. And I do apologize that this is really fast-paced and brief, but we're going to quickly look through each of these types, and you can come back and revise these afterwards when we share the slides with you. So some of the more familiar ones I'm going to go through really quickly, such as this one, true and false, one of the most kind of rudimentary question types. So you can see that the interface is actually fairly kind of clean and user-friendly. It's got the question type at the top. You would enter your question text. You would then indicate which is the correct answer. Is it true or is it false? You would allocate points to this particular question. And then at the top right, and this is something you would find on most questions in a similar position, you have some additional options, and each of these things are completely optional. You can add feedback, you can add a hint, you can add a short description, and you can also add enumeration in front of your options. So true, false is kind of one of the most rudimentary questions. So you're only going to have two options, and it's going to be either one or the other. So usually people don't add enumeration, but you can, if you would like to, add any of these options in front of the true, false. And once you have created a question, you have the option to either save it, or on the little drop down arrow, you'll see that you have an option to actually do save and new or save and copy. So save and new, and this is similar for all question types. Save and new means you save the current one and you open another similar question type. So it'll open a brand new true or false question type. It'll be a new blank one. If you say save and copy, that will save the current one, open a duplicate, another one of these exact true false questions, which contains your question text, your answers, and everything. So if you were going to have several questions that were really similar, you could use this option of save and copy and just make the slight tweaks that you would need to. So you kind of have three options. So save will save this and then kick you out of the editing option. Save and new gives you the exact same type of question, but a blank one. Save and copy gives you the same question type, but with all the content that you've already filled. Right, multiple choice is probably really familiar to you as well. So you can see at the top a similar, very similar format to the previous one. You've got your question type at the top there. You're going to add in your text. You're going to add in your answers and use the circular field there to indicate which is the correct answer. At the bottom there, next to number 3, you have an option to add additional answers. So if you wanted more than 4 options, you could just keep on adding answers. If you wanted to remove them, similarly, you would just click on the X on the right-hand side next to that field. And this is where you can also elect to randomize the answer order. You can allocate the points, and as with the previous true-false question, you have the additional options of adding feedback, hints, descriptions, custom weights, and enumeration. So you can see that the layout is fairly similar and quite intuitive. Seeing here from Aslam is saying, how do we add images to questions? All right, Aslam, some of the questions you'll see as we're going along, and also if you play around in your sandbox, some of the questions have the facility to use the rich text editor. In that instance, you would be able to add questions into the area where you're actually typing your question. So if the rich text editor is available, that's one way of getting images in. And then certain question types actually have a field where it's optional to upload an additional image or a supporting image. So depending on which question type you are using, that's 2 ways or potential ways that you could add an image to a question. Right, so that is multiple choice. And then on the next screen, we're going to have a look at the custom weights. So that was one of the options. Remember that you could have custom weights, and you can actually play around with this a little bit. So this is where you could potentially have more than one possible solution, and you could actually weight the answers according to correctness. So this is something where you can actually play around with it in your sandbox and see, if it works for your particular context, but it's just nice to know that you have this additional option of adding custom weights to the actual answers that you're using in your multiple choice. And then moving on to the next question type. This one is the multi-select. So it's kind of similar to the multiple choice, but of course, this is where you can have, you can actually have more than one option to select, as the name implies. So you can see that the format and the layout is very, very similar. You have your options as before in the top right-hand corner. You have your facility to add additional answers or remove excess answers with the little X on the right hand side. You also have the option to randomize the answer order. So it would give the options in a different random order. And then you can also allocate points. And then this one also decides how you would allocate, or points are assigned to blanks. So it sounds a little bit odd, the terminology that they're using there, but if you just think of it as how would you like to set up the scoring format or the options for scoring. And these are the options that you have there of all or nothing, or distributing the points evenly across all of them, having correct answers limited to the specific ones which are correct, or right minus wrong. So depending on how you would like to set up your question, and also bearing in mind that the more kind of detailed options and settings that you set, it could have other implications if you're putting a lot of other settings in place as well. So maybe play around with these a little bit, become familiar with what the options are, and see if this is something that would work for you. So you don't have to set those settings. These are mostly optional settings there. You can set points, obviously, but the scoring sometimes works better if it's kept relatively simple, but it's absolutely up to you. Right, on the next screen, we can see just an additional note here in terms of the points assigned. This gives you a little bit of a better understanding as to what those options are for all or nothing, correct selections, correct answers, limited selections, and right minus wrong selections. Sometimes the headings or the terminology, the way things are described is slightly confusing, but when you look at the description, then you get a better understanding of what those items actually mean. So this explains fairly nicely what those points assigned actually mean. Right, the next question type we're going to have a really quick look at is the written response. And as you'll be familiar with this one, this is something which is manually marked. So you would basically have your question text at the top. You can see there is an option there to enable the HTML editor for learner responses. So if you would like them to be able to add certain things into their responses, anything more than just basic text. So if that's links or formatting or bullet points or anything, you would enable the HTML editor for the learners. And you can see there's an option there that says allow learners to insert images and add attachments. So that's quite important if you would like to allow that. And there is your usual point system and your options that are available to you at the top right-hand side. And just a note here that it has been noted, I haven't actually checked this and experienced this myself within the Brightspace environment, but it was just a note that obviously, if you are writing a very long written response into the field within the quiz environment, it's possible that you might experience a timeout and potentially lose everything that was composed in that text field. So we do advise students, if you're going to be using this question type, to actually almost compose the response maybe in a Word document or somewhere else where they can actually swipe that and copy it into the field in one go. So they're not sitting for a very long time trying to compose the elements of that written response question. Right, the next question type we're going to take a look at is the short answer. So this is somewhat similar. And as you can see, you've got your question text area there. You can decide for this one if you would like to add blank fields, and the little drop down that's quite interesting there in the answers for the first blank, you have an option to actually select from text, and you can choose whether you'd like to make that case sensitive or not, or a regular expression as being the answers that the students should actually supply. And you can see you've got a button there to add additional blanks, and similarly you would be able to remove them as well. And you're going to allocate your points, and also similar to the one that we looked at before, if you have more than 2 blanks, then this option pops up of how you would like to assign the points. So these are kind of similar options to the ones we just looked at, but just to note that this point assignment only pops up if you've actually selected more than 1 blank for the students to complete. The next question type that we're going to have a look at is the multi-short answer. So here we have the general areas where you're going to enter into the title. So the title of the question is completely optional, but you would need to enter some question text. And on the right-hand side of the slide here, you can see the different multiple options there where you have your answers. You have options of applying weighting if you would like to. You also have the option of it being case sensitive or not, or being a regular expression. And then at the bottom there, you have question text and feedback. So these things, the feedback particularly, and hints, remember that feedback and hints are completely optional. You don't need to supply them. And sometimes it can actually be quite a lot of extra work to actually add this to question types. And on the next screen, you will see the fill in the blanks question type. So this one you're probably fairly familiar as well. You'll see that it is sometimes referred to as an FIB, a fib question. So you'll actually see that within the Brightspace environment that each question type actually has a shortened kind of acronym associated with it. So a fill in the blank, it is fairly straightforward. Titles are always optional because the questions are more identified by the actual text itself. You can allocate points. You can decide on a difficulty, so that you can see is not a mandatory field. Sometimes people like to grade their questions for difficulty so that when they're composing quizzes again, they want to have a selection of questions which may be some hard, some medium, and some really easy. So this is a way of kind of indicating or tagging your questions and rating them according to difficulty. And you can see here, Aslam, this particular question type has an option, as I was talking about, to actually insert an image. So depending on which question type you have the facility to add an image to various different question types in different ways. And on the next screen, you'll be able to see a little bit more detail as to where you would actually set the settings for this fill in the blank question type. So you can see here that we have text there, and there you can see it's a really small condensed version, but there is actually the rich text editor there. So that would be an option where in this particular part here, you could actually add an image in there. And there, as you can see, the hints and the feedback again is completely optional, and you don't need to complete that. It's not mandatory. And moving on to the next question type, we have matching, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this kind of question type, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. As you can see, the layout and composing this question type is very familiar or similar to some of the question types that we've had before. And here again, you can see that wherever you see the rich text editor, you would have the facility to add in images. So these would definitely support images, both in the choices and in the matching items there as well. And on the next slide, you'll see there again, you can add hints and feedback, just to remind you that this is completely optional. And here's just a screenshot showing you what this matching question would actually look like. So it's something where you have the items, you have the matching partners, and you would actually use the drop-down list to actually match up the numbers with the elements there. You would be choosing from a drop-down list essentially. Right, the next question type we're taking a look at is ordering, or you might know it as sequencing, putting things in order. As you can see, very similar layout to composing this question type as before. You've got your question text, and again, there's a button there where you can actually add an image, even though the question text itself is using the rich text editor. So there you could actually add the image yourself. And on the next screen, you will see in more detail, again, the parts where you could be actually adding in the elements. And this is another place here I've just highlighted, is where you can, the items are actually randomized when taking the question. So it's going to be an ordering question. So even if you put your elements in order when capturing your question, when they are presented to the student, they are already shuffled. So you don't have to capture them in a shuffled order. And again, your feedback and hints, absolutely optional. And we're heading towards the last few question types, and these are probably what you would maybe term as maybe the more complex ones. So this is the arithmetic one, where, as you would expect, you can have your mathematical symbols and your variables. And here you can see entering the question text. I'm just picking up on Chris's question here. Saying what option would be best to use for engineering type questions, where the students work on the questions and then scan in their handwritten solution. We need to manually mark these written response. Okay, so Chris, you've mentioned here that it would be handwritten. So that would be, they would do everything basically on a piece of paper, and it would almost be like a file submission, what we would use in Vula as a file submission question. So they're not actually using a particular question type that we've kind of covered here within the Brightspace environment, correct?
Yeah, correct. I mean, we've used tests and quizzes extensively the last 3 years on Vula, doing exactly that. We're going to need something similar in the Brightspace environment.
Right. Okay.
It'd just be an assignment rather than a test and quiz.
Yeah, so the difference between assignments and test and quiz, remember, is that a quiz, you can actually have a timer that's counting down. So if that's really necessary for you, you would have to use a question type. Remember, there was one which there was a couple of steps back. We won't go back to it now, but there was one a few steps back where there was an option to allow students to upload attachments.
That's
so
the
that
written
would
response, yeah.
Yeah. So that would effectively be like file upload in Vula. So anything where they could actually add an attachment, that would actually work for you for a file upload. So if a timer was imperative in your instance, you would actually have it in the quiz environment. If a timer was not so important and you just wanted to receive that file, then an assignment may be a better option for you to actually receive that.
Yeah, the problem with assignment is that it doesn't work well if you've got multiple questions that
Correct.
generally want different markers and things. So that's why we've used tests and quizzes for that in the past.
Correct, yes. So any question which had the facility for the student to actually do a file upload or an attachment, that would be your best option. Steph, thanks. Yeah, Stefan is saying, wouldn't assignments work better for that? Yeah. So Stefan, I think Chris has just answered your question in terms of like if there's multiple parts to it, then quizzes would be probably the option that would work best.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, I posted that at the start of the discussion.
No worries. No worries. Right, so this is the arithmetic question where, of course, as you've seen here, you can add a lot of additional variables and things. So on the next screen, you'll be able to see that slightly more in depth. I do realize that we are really running out of time really fast here. So I'm going to go over this really, really briefly, but there you can see the supported formulas. You can see where you would actually enter that in, and you can see you have quite a few options here to actually tweak these settings in terms of answer precision, tolerance, and units. And then if you would like it to be case insensitive, sensitive, or a regular expression. So that's the arithmetic content question type, and something which is similar to that. And here's just a screenshot showing you how you could actually note the variables and also again the feedback and the hints. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail because our time is running out, but something that's really similar to that kind of question is one which they term the significant figures. So you can see the initial layout is very similar. And on the next screen, you'll see that it also has similar elements to the arithmetic question type in the supported formulas where you enter it, and the tolerance and the units and various other settings that you can apply there. So you can see it's somewhat similar, and on the next screen you can also see that it has the same kind of area where you can add in variables, and you can also again have your hints and feedbacks. So apologies, that's really, really fast through the question types, but we will make these resources available to you. And I do believe that everyone in this webinar today is fairly familiar with the various different question types that are available. So you're probably working from something that's you've already created in Vula, and your primary concern is how do I recreate, or is there a space to do the same thing within the Brightspace environment? And other than those question types, a few other things that I just wanted to make you aware of really briefly is shuffling the questions and what I call pagination. So you've seen how to randomize certain answers within certain question types, but you can also shuffle the questions themselves within the order of the quiz. So that is, if you go to the setting here. So the first one is pertaining to questions per page. So how many questions would you like per page? And usually within the Vula environment, we have one question per page. And once they click that, they're actually then shown the next question on the next page. So that's usually what we recommend. And then in terms of paging, this is preventing a user moving backwards through the pages. So usually within Vula and within the Brightspace, if you haven't selected this, if they have skipped a question, or if they suddenly decide they would like to go back and change their answer, they can. But if you enable this checkbox here, it prevents them from moving backwards. And then this is where you would also find the checkbox for shuffle questions at the quiz level. So that means the questions themselves are shuffling, as opposed to certain question types which support randomization of the answers that are presented to the students. So just to note that these options only become available, obviously, once you've added questions to your quiz. So initially, you won't see these options. These will only be presented to you once you actually have content that you can shuffle, paginate. Right, and one other thing that I want to draw your attention to that we talked about yesterday are these action menus. So an action menu is a space where you will have a drop-down list and you will have various additional options offered to you. So on the quiz page at the top level where those buttons are, you will see something called More Actions. And there you'll see there's things like reorder, make visible, hide, and delete. So the bottom three are what we call multi-action functions. Those can only be invoked if you've actually selected one of the check boxes to apply that action to. So you can either select individual check boxes next to the applicable quiz that you would like to apply it to, or you select the one at the top, which is select all. And then apply any of those multi-action functions. The reorder option, which we're going to give you a quick look at on the next slide, gives you the options just to sort your quizzes into an order that you would like them. So you can see it's just using the basic drop-down lists and putting them 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is very similar to the way that you order forums and forum topics within the Vula environment. So very easy to reorder and sort the order of your particular quizzes. That's just for your purposes for finding things. And then going back onto the next slide, you will see that there's an actions menu that's also associated with a particular quiz as well. And you can see there's various different options here: edit, hide from users, preview, delete, copy, grade, set up reports, view reports, statistics, and attempt logs. So a lot of this content we're actually going to touch on tomorrow. And you can also see at the top, you can also view it by availability or by category. Remember, categories is something we said we'll take a look at tomorrow. So if we set up categories, and I'll show you how to do that tomorrow, when you view by category, it will show you a different order of your quizzes on this particular page. But on the next slide, you will also see there's an option called bulk edit. So this is where you can actually apply certain settings to, it's again a multi-action function. So you would need to select either distinct quizzes, or at the top level select all of the quizzes. And when you click on bulk edit, you'll see that it gives you the facility on the next slide. It will give you the facility to change certain things for all of these selected quizzes. So here you can see you can change the name, you can change categories, which we're going to deal with tomorrow. You can also, this is another place where you can quickly hide from users, and you can also change the attempts allowed. So this is a nice place to quickly have access to those particular settings and set them for multiple quizzes all at once. Right, and the final thing we're going to take a look at, two things, in fact, are these indicator icons. Just in case you notice them, these icons mean, the first one means it's associated with a grade item. The sideways key means that special access, so those are students that have special access outside of the usual settings of a quiz. And the little I with the line through it, similar to Vula, just means that it is actually hidden. And the last thing we're going to touch on really briefly is statistics, just so that you know that that is there. So on the quiz page right at the top, you'll see there's a tab which says statistics. Another way to get to it is on the action menu for a particular quiz. You'll see it right at the bottom there. There is a statistics link. And what can you expect to see on the statistics page? On the next page, you will actually see it shows you this. This one is very rudimentary, I must say, because this was just evaluating one submission, but it does give you an idea of what it is that you can expect to see for the statistics. You can see it gives you grade distribution, class averages, and along the top there, you can see that this is the user stats tab. There is an additional tab called question stats, and there's an additional tab called question details. I didn't print screen all of these because, of course, this was one submission, so the stats would look pretty sad. But as you can see, there is also an option to export to CSV and also export to Excel as well. So that's really nice that you can actually download these stats, and then you can kind of work with them in some other different environment should you need to. Right, so that is a really, really whirlwind tour through certain aspects of the quizzes. And thanks, Aslam. You're off to another meeting. And just going to quickly check in with you if there's any questions up until this point. You're welcome to switch on your mic.
Just checking that question of mine about the equivalent of numeric response in Vula, whether significant figures is meant to replace that.
I think that would be the closest thing to it. It would, of course, depend on how you've actually used the question, but I would really encourage you to go and play around with that in your sandbox and see if it suits your particular context, the way that you've used that particular question. But that would be the closest, yes.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Stefan. Any other questions at this stage? And apologies, that has been really, really fast, but as you can see, there's a lot to get through. And tomorrow we will be meeting at the same time and taking a look at quizzes again, but some of the other aspects pertaining to pools, libraries, categories, and sections. Right, I'm not seeing any further questions at this stage. We will send you the recording link and the link to the slides as soon as it is available. I want to thank you very much for being here and spending this time with us. And I hope you're going to join us again tomorrow at the same time. And I would also like to say thank you very much to Cheng-Wen, my colleague, for so ably handling the slides as we're going through. And I think I'm going to sign off at this point. Thank you very much, colleagues.